The laughter echoed around the room, sharp and biting. My family was at it again, Easter dinner, and their jokes about my broke status were flying faster than the dinner rolls. I just sat there, quiet, staring at the ham, barely muttering, "Pass the salt." Then, the front door swung open, and the bank president himself walked in, looked straight at me, and said, "Good to see you, major shareholder." My heart stopped. The aroma of ham and sweet potatoes usually filled our home with comfort, but this year it was mixed with the cloying scent of my brother Ryan's ego. He was at the kitchen island, holding court, regaling everyone with another tale of his latest business triumph. I was peeling carrots, a simple, grounding task, trying to tune out the details of his new BMW lease and the fancy steakhouse where he'd taken his girlfriend. Aunt Nancy gasped on cue. Uncle Bob nodded sagely, the kind of approval always reserved for Ryan's grand pronouncements in the wine. $200 a bottle, Ryan declared, waving his beer bottle dramatically. But hey, when you're closing deals like I am, you've got to celebrate properly. His eyes swept the room, landing on me, a familiar smirk playing on his lips. Right, Lisa? I mean, you probably wouldn't know about places like that. But trust me, it's worth every penny. I kept my focus on the carrots. Each precise cut of the knife was a small act of defiance, calming the familiar sting of his words. This was our Easter tradition. Ryan, arriving in flashy cars and expensive clothes, spending the entire day reminding everyone of his success. And me, the quiet, underestimated one, the cautionary tale, the daughter who'd chosen a simple life over ambition. Lisa's doing just fine, Mom interjected, her voice carrying that strained tone she used to quickly change the subject. She's got her little apartment downtown, and she seems happy enough. Little apartment. The judgment hung in the air, thick and heavy. I'd stopped trying to correct their assumptions years ago. Let them think what they wanted. Let them believe my modest Honda meant I was struggling. Let them assume my preference for quiet dinners at home was born of necessity, not choice. The truth was something I kept locked away, not out of shame, but pure exhaustion. I was tired of proving myself to people who had already decided who I was supposed to be. Ryan's voice cut through my thoughts again, sharp as a knife. You know what Lisa's problem is? He didn't wait for an answer. She's too scared to take risks. Always playing it safe. Always thinking small. That's why she's still renting that cramped place. While I'm looking at houses in Greenwood Estates, the development where every house looked exactly the same, where success was measured by square footage and the price of your outdoor furniture. I'd driven through it once, out of curiosity, and felt suffocated by its uniformity. Risk-taking is important, Dad chimed in, settling into his recliner with a satisfied grunt. A man has to be willing to put himself out there, make bold moves. That's how you get ahead in this world. A man, not a person, not his children. A man. I'd heard variations of this speech my entire life, usually with Ryan basking in the spotlight, and me fading into the background. The invisible daughter who'd chosen stability over spectacle, who'd somehow disappointed them by not crashing and burning dramatically enough to warrant their concern. I finished the carrots and moved to the living room. My cousin Amanda was sprawled across the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, her expression shifting to that particular brand of pity reserved for family members who hadn't quite lived up to their potential. So, Lisa, she purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Are you still working at that same place, the insurance company? I wasn't. I hadn't worked there in 3 years. But correcting Amanda would require explanation. An explanation would lead to questions I wasn't ready to answer. So I just nodded, settling into the corner chair that had become my designated spot. That's nice, Amanda continued, her attention already drifting back to her phone. Job security and all that. Not everyone can be an entrepreneur like Ryan. Ryan preened at the compliment, launching into another story about his latest client acquisition. I let the words wash over me, focusing instead on the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the bay window. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, peaceful in a way that reminded me why I'd loved this house as a child. Before success became the only measure of worth, Before every conversation turned into a comparison. Before I learned that being quietly content was somehow a failure in their eyes. The thing was, I hadn't always been the family disappointment. In high school, I'd been the one with straight A's, the full scholarship to state university, the one teachers praised for my work ethic and creativity. But somewhere along the way, Ryan's flashier accomplishments had overshadowed my steadier achievements. His sales awards were more impressive than my dean's list recognition. His company car was more visible than my academic honors. His loud confidence commanded attention in a way my quiet competence never could. And I'd let it happen. I'd retreated into myself, stopped sharing my victories, stopped trying to compete for recognition that felt increasingly hollow. It was easier to be the overlooked daughter than to constantly fight for attention. Anyway, Lisa probably couldn't even afford a weekend in the city, Ryan was saying now, his voice carrying that casual cruelty he'd perfected over the years. I mean, with rent and student loans and everything. It's tough out there for people without real career prospects. Student loans. If only he knew. I'd paid those off 2 years ago, along with the mortgage on the downtown building I'd quietly purchased through an LLC. But Ryan lived in a world where assumptions were facts, where his limited understanding of my life was treated as gospel truth. Mom glanced at me, her expression a mix of concern and resignation. In her mind, I was the daughter who needed protecting, who needed gentle handling because life had been harder on me than on her golden boy. She meant well, but her sympathies stung worse than Ryan's mockery. Easter's supposed to be about family, she said finally, her voice carrying just enough reproach to quiet Ryan's commentary. Let's focus on being grateful for what we have. What we have. I looked around the room at these people who shared my DNA but understood nothing about my actual life. Ryan, whose definition of success was entirely external, whose happiness seemed to depend on others recognizing his achievements. Mom and Dad, who'd convinced themselves that their son's bragging was confidence, while their daughter's discretion was defeat. Amanda, who measured everyone's worth by how their stories compared to her own. I'd spent years in this room absorbing their judgments, letting their narrow definitions of success make me question my own choices. But something had shifted in me over the past few months. Maybe it was turning 30 and finally understanding that their approval wasn't worth the price of pretending to be someone I wasn't. Maybe it was the growing realization that their version of family felt more like performance than connection. Or maybe it was the phone call I'd received 3 days ago, the one that had changed everything in ways they couldn't even imagine. I excused myself to help Mom in the kitchen, grateful for a moment away from Ryan's ongoing monologue. She was busy basting the ham, her movements efficient and practiced, the way they'd been every Easter for as long as I could remember. You know, he doesn't mean anything by it, she said without looking up, as if she could read my thoughts. He's just excited about his success. You remember how he was when he made varsity football? Same energy. I remembered. Ryan had always been the kind of person who needed an audience for his achievements, who processed his own worth through other people's reactions. It wasn't malicious, exactly, but it was exhausting to be the constant measuring stick for his accomplishments. I know, Mom, I said, reaching for the dinner rolls that needed warming. I just wish what, honey? I paused, wondering how to finish that sentence. I wish they saw me as more than their cautionary tale. I wish success didn't have to be loud to be valid. I wished I could share my actual life with them without it feeling like I was trying to prove something. I wished Easter dinner could be about connection instead of competition. Nothing, I said finally. The rolls smell amazing. She smiled, the kind of tired smile that came from years of managing family dynamics, from playing referee between personalities that seemed determined to clash. I wondered sometimes if she was as exhausted by these gatherings as I was. If she ever missed the simpler holidays from when we were children, before money became the metric for everything. The doorbell rang just as we were setting the last dishes on the dining room table. Dad called out from his recliner. Someone get that, will you? Probably the neighbors with their Easter cookies. But it wasn't the neighbors. Through the front window, I could see a black sedan in the driveway. Expensive but understated, the kind of car that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. My stomach tightened. I recognized it. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't supposed to happen today. Ryan, ever eager to be the first to greet any newcomer who might become an audience for his stories, bounded to the door and swung it open with a theatrical flourish. His confident smile faltered slightly when he saw the man standing on the porch. Mr. Harrison was exactly as I remembered him from our meeting last month. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that managed to look both professional and approachable. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. But his expression was warm, almost grandfatherly. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of the southern accent that made him sound like he'd stepped out of an old movie. "I'm looking for Lisa Parker. I hope I'm not interrupting your family celebration." The room went silent. Even Amanda looked up from her phone. Ryan's mouth opened and closed like he was trying to process why someone this clearly important would be asking for his unremarkable sister. I stepped forward, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Mr. Harrison, I wasn't expecting you." His face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Lisa, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I was driving back from my own family gathering and realized I'd be passing right by Riverside. I had some documents that couldn't wait until our meeting tomorrow, and I thought, well, why not deliver them personally?" Documents. Tomorrow's meeting. The words hung in the air like breadcrumbs, leading to a truth that none of them were prepared to follow. Mom appeared at my elbow, her hostess instincts kicking in despite her obvious confusion. "Won't you come in? I'm Carol Parker, Lisa's mother. We were just sitting down to Easter dinner." Mr. Harrison's smile widened. "How lovely. I don't want to impose, but Lisa, if you have just a moment, these papers really are time-sensitive." I nodded, acutely aware of every pair of eyes in the room tracking my movements. This wasn't how I'd imagined this moment. If I'd imagined it at all, I'd planned to keep my two worlds separate, to let my family continue believing whatever they needed to believe about my life. But here was Mr. Harrison, standing in Mom's meticulously decorated living room, holding what looked like a leather portfolio that probably contained more money than Ryan made in a year. Of course, I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "Should we step into the kitchen?" "Actually," Mr. Harrison said, glancing around the room with the kind of practiced assessment that came from years of reading people and situations. "Since this is a family celebration, and since these documents affect some significant decisions you'll need to make, perhaps your family should hear this, too. That is, if you're comfortable with that." I looked at their faces. Ryan's confusion was shifting towards something that looked almost like panic. Dad had muted the television and was leaning forward in his chair. Mom's polite smile was becoming strained around the edges. Amanda had actually put her phone down. They wanted to know. Of course, they wanted to know. For the first time in years, I was the center of attention in this room, and not because I was being used as an example of what not to do. "All right," I said, surprising myself with the decision. "Yes, they can hear it." Mr. Harrison nodded approvingly and opened his portfolio. "Excellent. Well, then, Lisa, I'm pleased to inform you that the quarterly dividends from your shares in Harrison Industries have exceeded our projections by 18%. Your total return for this quarter alone is $2.4 million. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from 3 rooms away. $2.4 million. This quarter alone. Ryan's face had gone completely pale. Mom's hand flew to her chest. Dad's recliner creaked as he sat up straighter than I'd seen him sit in years. "Furthermore," Mr. Harrison continued, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather, "the board met last week to discuss the expansion into the Southeast markets. And as our third largest shareholder, your approval is needed for the final phase of the acquisition. I have the contracts here for your review." Third largest shareholder. The words seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the room. Mr. Harrison looked around at their stunned faces and chuckled softly. "I do hope I haven't said too much. Lisa, you did mention that you prefer to keep your business affairs private, but I assumed your family knew about your involvement with the company." I met his eyes and saw the twinkle there. The subtle amusement of a man who'd spent decades in boardrooms and could read a family dynamic in 30 seconds. He knew exactly what he'd done. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. This was a gift wrapped in the form of a business visit. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison, I said, finding my voice again. I'll review everything tonight and have my decision to you by tomorrow afternoon. Wonderful. And please do consider my offer about joining the board officially. Your instincts for market timing have been invaluable, and frankly, we could use more voices like yours in our strategic planning meetings. He closed the portfolio and handed it to me. The weight of it was solid and real in my hands. Now, I'll leave you to your family celebration. It smells absolutely divine in hay. Mrs. Parker, you're a lucky family to have such a wonderful cook. Mom managed to croak, thank you. But her eyes never left my face. Mr. Harrison moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Lisa, the Riverside Community Foundation called about your anonymous donation to the new children's library. They are hoping to announce the major benefactor at the groundbreaking ceremony next month. I told them I'd pass along their request. Anonymous donation. Children's library. The hits just kept coming. After he left, the silence stretched until it became unbearable. I could feel their stares, their confusion, their desperate need to understand how their underachieving daughter had just been revealed as someone they didn't recognize at all. Ryan was the first to find his voice. What the hell just happened? I looked at him, at all of them. These people who'd spent years treating me like their charity case, their cautionary tale, their reminder of what happened when you didn't dream big enough. I guess, I said quietly, we need to talk. The aftermath of Mr. Harrison's visit felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Everyone remained frozen in their positions, as if moving might shatter whatever fragile reality we were all trying to process. The ham was getting cold on the dining room table, but nobody seemed to notice or care about Easter dinner anymore. Ryan's face had cycled through several shades of red before settling on a sickly pale green. He kept opening his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closing it again when no words came out. For someone who made his living talking to clients, he seemed to have completely lost the ability to form coherent sentences. Dad was the first to break the silence, his voice low and uncertain. Lisa, honey, what did that man just say? Did he say $2 million? $2.4 million. Amanda whispered, her phone completely forgotten in her lap. He said $2.4 million asterisk this quarter star. Mom sank into the nearest chair, her hands still pressed to her chest. I don't understand. Lisa, sweetheart, what company? What shares? When did this happen? I stood there holding Mr. Harrison's leather portfolio, feeling the weight of it in my hands and the weight of their stares on my shoulders. This moment had been inevitable, I supposed. I'd been living two completely separate lives for so long that eventually they were bound to collide. I just hadn't expected it to happen over Easter dinner, with my entire family as witnesses. It's a long story, I said finally, my voice sounding strange in the continued quiet of the room. We've got time, Ryan managed, his voice cracking slightly on the words. We've got all the time in the world. I looked at each of their faces, seeing curiosity and confusion, but also something else, something that looked almost like fear. The comfortable dynamic they'd all settled into, where I was the family disappointment and Ryan was the golden child, had just been completely upended. They were looking at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into their living room wearing a familiar face. I walked over to the couch and sat down, still clutching the portfolio. It started about 5 years ago, I began, my voice growing steadier as I found my footing in the truth. I was still working at the insurance company, but I'd been investing on the side. Small amounts at first, just whatever I could spare from my paycheck. Investing in what? Dad asked, leaning forward in his recliner. Tech stocks initially, then some real estate investment trusts. I'd always been good with numbers, good at seeing patterns. You remember how I used to balance Mom's checkbook when I was in high school because I could spot the errors the bank made? Mom nodded slowly, a distant look in her eyes as she recalled those long-ago evenings when I'd sit at the kitchen table with a statement spread out in front of me, finding discrepancies that the bank's computers had missed. Well, I applied that same kind of analytical thinking to the stock market. I started small, researching companies, studying their financial reports, tracking market trends. I wasn't trying to get rich quick. I was just trying to build something stable for my future. Ryan's voice was barely audible. How much did you start with? $300, I said, watching his expression shift from disbelief to something approaching nausea. My tax refund from that year. I put it into a tech startup that was developing software for small businesses. The company was called Harrison Industries. Harrison, Amanda repeated, like the man who was just here. His grandson founded the company. James Harrison was 24, fresh out of MIT, with an idea for streamlining inventory management for restaurants and retail stores. Nobody thought much of it. The big investment firms weren't interested because the market seemed too niche. But I saw something they didn't. I paused, remembering those early days when I'd spent my evenings researching companies from my tiny studio apartment, living on ramen noodles and determination. It felt like a lifetime ago, but also like yesterday. I saw that every small business owner I'd ever met struggled with the same problems. They couldn't afford the big enterprise software solutions, but they were drowning in paperwork and inefficient systems. James' software was simple, affordable, and it actually worked. So, I bought 10 shares. 10 shares. Dad echoed. For $300. $30 a share. I confirmed. 6 months later, Harrison Industries landed their first major contract with a restaurant chain in Ohio. The stock jumped to $60 a share. I could have sold and doubled my money, but I didn't. Why not? Mom asked, genuinely curious now. Because I'd done more research. I could see that they were just getting started. The restaurant chain was already talking about expanding their contract. Other businesses were starting to pay attention. So instead of selling, I bought more shares. I looked around the room, seeing the beginning of understanding dawn on their faces. This wasn't a story about getting lucky once. This was about making a series of calculated decisions over years, about seeing opportunities that others missed, about having the patience to let those decisions compound. Every time I got a bonus at work, every time I had a little extra money, I put it into Harrison Industries. Not because I was gambling, but because I understood their business model better than most of their investors did. I knew their target market because I'd worked with small business owners through the insurance company. I understood their challenges, and I could see how Harrison Solutions addressed real problems. Ryan's face was a mixture of confusion and something that might have been admiration. How many shares do you own now? I opened the portfolio and glanced at the top document, though I knew the numbers by heart. 873,000 shares. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the silence of shock anymore. This was the silence of people trying to do math in their heads, trying to understand numbers that were too large to easily comprehend. As of market close on Friday, Amanda's voice was barely a whisper, about $6 to $7 million. Mom made a small sound that might have been a gasp or might have been a laugh. Dad's recliner creaked as he sat back heavily. Ryan looked like he might be sick. But that's not the whole story, I continued, feeling oddly liberated by finally sharing this part of my life. About 3 years ago, James Harrison approached me directly. The company was growing faster than they'd anticipated, and they needed capital for expansion. But more than that, they needed investors who understood their vision. He approached you personally. Mom asked. My investment history spoke for itself. I'd been buying their stock consistently for 2 years, through ups and downs, never panic selling when the market dipped, never getting greedy when it surged. That kind of pattern tells a story about an investor's character and confidence in the company. I thought back to that first meeting with James Harrison, how nervous I'd been, sitting in his sleek downtown office, still wearing my insurance company blazer and clutching a folder full of my own research notes. He'd been younger than I'd expected, with an intensity that reminded me of myself when I was deep in analysis mode. He offered me the chance to buy a significant stake in the company at a preferential rate, but only if I was willing to take an active role in strategic decisions. He said they needed investors who understood the market from the ground up, not just from spreadsheets. So, you quit your job? Dad asked. Not right away. I started as a consultant, working evenings and weekends, helping them identify new market opportunities and potential partnerships. The insurance company actually became one of their first enterprise clients after I showed my boss how Harrison's software could streamline our claims processing. I smiled, remembering how surreal it had felt to be in a business meeting where I was simultaneously the employee suggesting the vendor and the part owner of that vendor. The ethics had been complicated, but everything had been above board and disclosed properly. When did you quit? Ryan's voice was strange, like he was asking about someone else's life rather than his sister's. Last year, James offered me a position on the board of directors, and the quarterly dividends for my shares were already more than my annual salary at the insurance company. It seemed like the right time to make the transition. What do you do now? Amanda asked. I mean, day to day. I evaluate potential acquisitions for Harrison Industries. We're expanding into new markets, buying smaller companies that complement our core business. I spend a lot of time traveling, meeting with business owners, analyzing financial statements, negotiating deals. It's not glamorous work, but it's work I'm good at. I could see them all trying to reconcile this version of me with the quiet, unremarkable daughter and sister they thought they knew. The woman who traveled for business acquisitions, who sat on corporate boards, who made decisions involving millions of dollars, didn't fit with their image of Lisa, who couldn't afford weekend trips to the city. The apartment downtown. Mom said slowly, You said you were renting. I never said I was renting. You assumed I was renting. I felt a small stab of guilt at the technicality, but it was true. I'd never lied to them directly. I just never corrected their assumptions. I bought the building 3 years ago. The penthouse is mine. I rent out the other units. The building? Ryan repeated flatly. You own the building. It's a good investment property. Downtown Riverside is gentrifying faster than most people realize. Property values have increased 30% since I bought it. Dad was shaking his head slowly, like he was trying to clear water from his ears. Lisa, honey, why didn't you tell us? All this time we thought. You thought I was the family failure, I finished gently. You thought I was too scared to take risks, too content with mediocrity, too lacking in ambition to achieve anything meaningful. The words hung in the air, not accusatory, but factual. We all knew it was true. That's not. Mom started, then stopped because she couldn't finish the sentence honestly. It's okay, I said, and realized that I meant it. I let you think that because it was easier than constantly defending my choices. When I drove my Honda instead of leasing a BMW, you saw it as evidence that I couldn't afford better. I saw it as not wanting to waste money on status symbols. When I chose quiet dinners at home over expensive restaurants, you saw limitation. I saw preference. I looked directly at Ryan, whose face had gone through another color change. When you talked about my lack of career prospects, I didn't correct you because I didn't need your validation. I knew what I was building. I knew what I was worth. Your opinion of my success didn't change the reality of my bank account. But why keep it secret? Amanda asked. Why let us think you were struggling? It was a fair question and one I'd asked myself many times over the years. The answer was complicated, layered with years of family dynamics and personal choices that had seemed reasonable at the time, but looked different now under the harsh light of revelation. Because I'd spent my whole life watching this family equate worth with wealth, I said carefully. I watched Ryan's achievements get celebrated because they were visible and loud, while accomplishments that were quieter got overlooked or dismissed. I didn't want my relationship with any of you to change because of money. But it has changed anyway, Ryan said quietly. It's changing right now. He was right. Of course. The moment Mr. Harrison had walked through the door, everything had shifted. The balance of power, the family hierarchy, the assumptions we'd all lived with for years. It was all different now. I also didn't want to become the family bank, I admitted. I've watched what happens in families where one person has significantly more money than the others. Suddenly, every conversation becomes about loans and investments and expectations. I wanted to avoid that dynamic. Mom's face crumpled slightly. Did you think we'd only love you for your money? No, I said quickly, because that wasn't quite right. But I thought the money might change how you saw me. And I like being loved for who I was rather than what I had, even if who you thought I was wasn't entirely accurate. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to preserve their love, I'd accepted their pity. In trying to avoid being valued for my wealth, I'd allowed myself to be devalued for my perceived lack of it. Besides, I added, I wasn't ready to handle your reactions, Ryan. You've spent years using my supposed financial struggles as a measuring stick for your own success. Dad, you've given countless speeches about risk-taking and ambition while using me as an example of what happens when someone plays it too safe. Mom, you've worried about me and tried to protect me from a reality that didn't actually exist. I gestured around the room, taking in their stunned faces. This reaction right here is exactly what I was trying to avoid. The shock, the confusion, the need to completely recalibrate how you see me and yourselves. It's exhausting for everyone involved. So, you were just going to keep pretending forever? Ryan asked, and there was something raw in his voice that I hadn't heard before. I don't know, I answered. Honestly, I hadn't really thought about forever. I was just taking it one family gathering at a time, one conversation at a time. It became a habit, I suppose. The longer it went on, the harder it became to imagine changing it. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't entirely true, either. Something had been shifting in me over the past few months. A growing exhaustion with a pretense, a desire to be fully known by the people who claimed to love me. Maybe Mr. Harrison's unexpected visit wasn't as accidental as it seemed. Maybe I'd mentioned my family's Easter gathering because some part of me wanted this moment to happen. What happens now? Mom asked, her voice small and uncertain. It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. What did happen now? How do you rebuild family relationships on a foundation of truth after years of carefully maintained fiction? How do you navigate the complex emotions of people who are simultaneously proud of your success and hurt by your secrecy? I don't know, I said again, because it was the only honest answer I had. I suppose we figure it out together. Ryan stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. I need some air, he said, and walked out the back door into Mom's garden. Through the window, I watched him pace among the Easter lilies, his phone pressed to his ear, probably calling his girlfriend or maybe his business partner, trying to process this new reality where his underachieving sister was actually more successful than he'd ever dreamed of being. His hate, Mom said softly, following my gaze. I know, I replied. I'm sorry about that. Are you? Dad asked, and there was no judgment in the question, just curiosity. I thought about it honestly. I'm sorry he's hurt. I'm not sorry I kept it private. Those are two different things. Amanda had picked up her phone again, but she wasn't scrolling mindlessly. She was staring at the blank screen, lost in thought. I told everyone at work that my cousin was struggling financially, she said suddenly. I used you as an example when we were talking about the importance of career planning. I said you were what happened when someone didn't set clear goals. The admission hung between us, awkward and painful, but it also felt necessary, like lancing a wound that had been festering for too long. I know, I said gently. I heard about it through mutual friends. It's okay, Amanda. You didn't know. But I should have known, she insisted. We're family. I should have asked more questions, paid more attention. I should have wondered why someone as smart as you was supposedly stuck in a dead-end job. It was a fair point and one that spoke to larger issues in how we'd all related to each other over the years. We'd gotten into the habit of making assumptions rather than asking questions, of accepting surface narratives rather than digging deeper into each other's actual lives. We all made assumptions, I said. I let you make them, which makes me complicit in the misunderstanding. Mom was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. What about the foundation donation? Mr. Harrison mentioned the children's library. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. This was the part of my financial life that felt most personal, most revealing of who I actually was beneath all the secrecy and misdirection. Riverside's library system is underfunded, I said simply. The children's section especially. They've been trying to build a new branch on the east side of town for years, but they could never raise enough money. So, I helped. How much? Dad asked. Enough to fund the entire project. $2.8 million. The number seemed to echo in the room. Nearly $3 million donated anonymously to build a library for children in a town where I'd grown up, where I'd spent countless hours as a kid, losing myself in books because they offered an escape from family dynamics that often felt suffocating. That's why you wanted to stay anonymous, Mom said, understanding dawning on her face. You knew if people found out Lisa Parker had donated that much money, word would get back to us. Partly, I admitted, but also because the donation wasn't about recognition. It was about the library. I wanted the focus to be on the building and the programs it would fund, not on who paid for it. We sat in relative quiet for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Outside, Ryan had finished his phone call and was sitting on the garden bench, staring at Mom's rose bushes like they might hold answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. The Easter ham was definitely cold by now, and the carefully prepared side dishes were congealing on the dining room table, but none of us seemed hungry anymore. This conversation was too important, too long overdue to interrupt for food. I have questions, Dad said finally. I figured you would, but I don't know how to ask them without sounding like I'm interrogating you, or like I'm trying to figure out what this means for us financially. His honesty was refreshing and painful at the same time. Ask whatever you want to ask, Dad. We're past the point of polite avoidance now. He was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. Are you happy? He asked finally. With your life, with your work, with your choices. Not the money part, but the rest of it. It wasn't the question I'd expected, but it was maybe the most important one he could have asked. Yes, I said, and realized how true it was. I'm happier than I've been in years. The work is challenging and meaningful. I'm good at it, and I can see the impact it has on the businesses we acquire and the communities they serve. I wake up excited about projects I'm working on. I go to sleep feeling like I've contributed something valuable to the world. That's what matters, Mom said softly. That's what we always wanted for both of you kids. But even as she said it, I could see the questions in her eyes. The doubt about whether that was really what they'd wanted, or whether they'd gotten so caught up in measuring success through external markers that they'd lost sight of what actually mattered. The back door opened and Ryan came back inside, his face composed, but his eyes red-rimmed. He sat down heavily on the couch across from me, his usual swagger completely absent. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. Actually, I owe you about 1,000 apologies, but I'll start with one. I waited, letting him find his words. I've been an ass, he continued. For years, I've been using you as my measuring stick, making myself feel better about my own insecurities by putting you down. I told myself it was just sibling rivalry, that it was harmless teasing, but it wasn't. It was cruel and it was constant, and you didn't deserve it. His voice cracked slightly on the last words. The worst part is I think some part of me knew I was wrong about you. You were always too smart, too composed, too confident for someone who was actually struggling. But I didn't want to look too closely, because then I'd have to admit that my whole sense of superiority was built on a lie. It was more self-awareness than I'd ever heard from Ryan, and more honesty than he'd shown in years. I felt something tight in my chest begin to loosen. Thank you, I said simply. That means a lot. I don't know how to be your brother now, he admitted. I don't know how to relate to you when everything I thought I knew was wrong. You start by being honest, I suggested, about who you are, what you want, what scares you. And you asked me to do the same. We figure out who we actually are to each other, not who we've been pretending to be. He nodded slowly, like he was absorbing the idea. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think less of me now? Now that you know I've been bragging about achievements that don't even come close to what you've accomplished? It was a vulnerable question, asked without his usual bravado or defensiveness. For the first time in years, I was seeing my brother as he actually was, rather than as the character he played for our family. I think you're good at sales. You work hard and you've built a solid career, I said carefully. I think you're also insecure about your worth in ways that make you competitive about things that don't matter. But that's not unique to you, Ryan. Most people struggle with those feelings. But you don't. I struggle with different things. I struggle with letting people see who I really am. I struggle with asking for help when I need it. I struggle with accepting that I deserve love even when I'm not being useful or productive. I paused, considering. Success doesn't solve personality flaws, Ryan. It just gives you different problems to work through. Amanda had been uncharacteristically quiet during Ryan's apology, but now she spoke up. This is going to sound selfish, she said, but I need to know something. Have you been laughing at us this whole time? When we talk about money problems or career stress, have you been secretly thinking about how naive we are? No, I said immediately, because that concern I could address directly. Never. Your problems are real, even if they're different from mine. Financial stress doesn't become less valid because someone else has more money. Career anxiety doesn't disappear because someone else has a different kind of job. But surely you must think we're small-minded, she pressed, worried about things that seem insignificant from your perspective. I thought about how to answer that. Honestly, I think we all have a tendency to assume our problems are the most important problems, and that everyone else's struggles are less real than our own. But I've never thought your concerns were silly or unimportant. Different, yes, but not less valid. The conversation was interrupted by Mom's phone ringing. She glanced at the screen. It's your Aunt Carol, probably wondering where we are with dinner. She's supposed to stop by for dessert. The reminder of the outside world, of normal Easter traditions and expected social pleasantries, fell jarring after the intensity of the past hour. How do you go back to small talk about weather and work gossip when you've just fundamentally altered the foundation of your family relationships? What do we tell people? Mom asked, voicing what we were all thinking. Whatever you want to tell them, I said. This is your information now, too. You can share it or keep it private. Whatever feels right to you. But what do you want? Dad asked. I want you to be comfortable, I said honestly. I want you to be able to talk about your daughter's life without having to maintain a fiction. But I also don't want my financial situation to become the primary topic of conversation at every family gathering for the next decade. Ryan laughed. A short, sharp sound. I think that ship has sailed, Lisa. This is going to be the topic of conversation for a very long time. He was probably right. The revelation was too big, too shocking, too contrary to everything they believed about me to be absorbed quickly. There would be months of processing, of questions, of adjustments to how they understood our family dynamic. There's something else, I said, knowing I needed to address it before we moved on to the practical questions of how to handle the immediate future. Mr. Harrison mentioned that Harrison Industries is considering me for an official board position. If I accept it, it would mean more travel, more public visibility, more opportunities for people to connect me to the company's success. Would you want that? Mom asked. I think so. The work would be challenging, and I'd have more influence over the company's direction, but it would also make it much harder to maintain privacy about my financial situation. Maybe it's time to stop trying to maintain that privacy, Dad suggested gently. I looked around the room at these people who'd known me my whole life but were just now meeting me for the first time. They were right, of course. The elaborate fiction I'd maintained was exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. But letting go of it felt like stepping off a cliff, not knowing what kind of landing waited below. Maybe it is, I agreed. The decision to have Aunt Carol and Uncle Bob join us for dessert felt surreal under the circumstances, but Mom insisted that canceling would raise more questions than we were ready to answer. So, we found ourselves in the strange position of reheating Easter dinner and pretending that nothing earth-shattering had just occurred in the Parker family living room. I watched Mom bustle around the kitchen, her movements more frantic than usual as she tried to process everything while simultaneously preparing for company. She kept glancing at me like she was checking to make sure I was real, that the past hour hadn't been some elaborate hallucination brought on by too much cooking and wine. Should I put the good china away? She asked, gesturing toward the formal place setting she'd arranged earlier. I mean, if we're just having dessert. Mom, I said gently. It's fine. Use whatever dishes you want. Aunt Carol isn't going to notice if we eat pie off paper plates or wedding china. But I could see that the question wasn't really about dishes. It was about normal. She was grasping for some semblance of the routine, predictable Easter she'd planned. The one where her biggest worry was whether the ham would be too dry, and her biggest excitement would be seeing if Uncle Bob remembered to bring his famous coconut cake. Ryan had disappeared upstairs, claiming he needed to change his shirt. But I suspected he was really trying to gather himself before facing the extended family. The revelation about my financial situation had hit him harder than anyone else, probably because his entire sense of self had been built on being the successful Parker child. Now he had to figure out who he was when that narrative no longer held true. Dad was in his study, ostensibly checking email, but actually hiding from the emotional complexity of the afternoon. I could hear him on the phone, his voice low and controlled, probably talking to his brother about something completely unrelated to Easter dinner or family revelations. It was his way of finding equilibrium, focusing on external concerns when internal ones became too overwhelming. Amanda had offered to help with dinner preparations, but mostly she was asking questions that I could tell had been building up since Mr. Harrison left. They weren't the big questions about money or business strategy. They were smaller, more personal inquiries that revealed how little we all really knew about each other's daily lives. "Do you have an office?" she asked while folding napkins. "I mean, like a real office with a secretary and everything." "I have office space in the Harrison Industries building downtown," I replied, arranging glasses on a serving tray. "But I don't have a traditional secretary. I have an assistant who helps coordinate my travel and manages my calendar. But she works with several of the board members." "What does your office look like?" I thought about the corner suite on the 15th floor with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river and its minimalist furniture that had cost more than most people's cars. "It's nice," I said simply. "Professional, good natural light." "That's it? That's all you're going to tell me?" I smiled despite the tension of the afternoon. "It is a conference table for 6, a desk that's probably too big for the space, and a view of the water. The walls are painted gray, and there's artwork from local artists that the company commissioned." "Is there something specific you want to know?" "I want to know what it feels like," she said, her voice more serious than I'd expected. "What it feels like to walk into a building where you own part of the company, where people call you Ms. Parker and mean it respectfully, where your opinion actually matters in rooms full of important people." The question caught me off guard with its perceptiveness. Amanda had always seemed focused on surface details, on the visible markers of success that impressed other people. But this question was about something deeper, about the internal experience of professional authority and respect. "It feels surreal sometimes," I admitted, like I'm playing a role that doesn't quite fit yet. "But it also feels right, like I'm finally using skills I'd been developing for years without realizing it." The opinions I'd formed about businesses and markets turned out to be valuable to people who make decisions about millions of dollars. "Do you ever feel like an imposter?" "Every day," I said honestly. Especially in the beginning, I'd sit in board meetings with people who had Harvard MBAs and decades of experience, and I'd wonder what I was doing there. But then I'd see something they missed, or I'd ask a question that changed how we approached a problem, and I'd remember that I earned my seat at that table. Amanda nodded thoughtfully, and I realized that she was asking these questions, not just out of curiosity, but because she was trying to understand something about ambition and success that she'd never had to consider before. In our family, Ryan's path had always seemed like the obvious template for achievement. Go to college, get a sales job, work your way up through visible accomplishments, measure success by salary and status symbols. My path had been different, quieter, more strategic. I'd built wealth through patience and analysis rather than networking and charisma. I'd gained influence through competence rather than self-promotion. It was a model of success that didn't fit the conventional narrative they'd all grown up believing. The doorbell rang, announcing Aunt Carol and Uncle Bob's arrival, and I felt my stomach tighten with anxiety. How do you act normal around family members who don't know that your entire financial situation has just been revealed as a carefully maintained fiction? How do you make small talk about work and weather when you've just learned that your niece is worth tens of millions of dollars? "I'll get it," Mom called, smoothing her hair and checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, looking back at me with an expression that was part question, part plea. "We don't have to tell them anything today," I said quietly. "This can stay between us until you're ready to share it." She nodded gratefully and opened the door to reveal Aunt Carol's bright smile and Uncle Bob's familiar wave. They bustled in with their usual energy, carrying containers of leftovers from their own family gathering and talking over each other about traffic and the weather and their neighbor's new landscaping project. "Lisa," Aunt Carol exclaimed, pulling me into a hug that smelled like her signature perfume and Easter lilies. You look wonderful, honey. That color is perfect on you. I was wearing a simple blue sweater that I'd bought 3 years ago at a department store. It wasn't expensive or particularly fashionable, but Aunt Carol's compliment felt loaded with new meaning. Was she really commenting on my appearance? Or was she unconsciously responding to some change in my demeanor? Some confidence that came from finally telling the truth about my life. Thank you, I said, accepting her hug and Uncle Bob's hearty handshake. How was your dinner? Did Cousin Michael make it home from college? As they launched into updates about their own Easter celebration, I found myself studying their faces, wondering how they would react to the news about my financial situation when Mom and Dad eventually decided to share it. Aunt Carol had always been proud of Ryan's achievements, quick to brag about his sales numbers and his latest purchases. Uncle Bob had a tendency to offer unsolicited career advice, especially to family members he perceived as underachieving. Would they be proud of my success? Or would they feel deceived by my years of letting them believe I was struggling? Would they ask for investment advice? Or worse, for loans? Would family gatherings become awkward negotiations around money and expectations? Where's Ryan? Aunt Carol asked, looking around the living room. I wanted to hear about his latest business triumph. His upstairs changing, Mom said quickly. He'll be down in a minute. But when Ryan finally appeared, he looked like a different person than the confident, boastful man who'd been regaling us with success stories just hours earlier. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a quieter energy that made him seem younger and more uncertain. Hey, Aunt Carol, Uncle Bob, he said, accepting their hugs with less enthusiasm than usual. You look tired, sweetheart, Aunt Carol said, studying his face with the kind of maternal attention she'd always lavished on both Ryan and me. Are you working too hard? Something like that, Ryan replied, avoiding my eyes. The conversation over dessert felt strained, full of undercurrents that Aunt Carol and Uncle Bob couldn't identify, but clearly sensed. Mom's responses were distracted. Dad seemed unusually quiet, and Ryan appeared to be actively avoiding any topics related to work or success. I found myself overcompensating, asking detailed questions about their retirement plans and the recent trip to Florida. Anything to fill the awkward silences. You're awfully chatty today, Lisa, Uncle Bob observed with a smile. Usually, you're our quiet observer. It's nice to hear more from you. The comment made me realize how dramatically my behavior had shifted. For years, I'd been content to fade into the background during family gatherings, letting Ryan dominate conversations while I listened politely from the sidelines. But something about finally telling the truth had freed me to engage more actively, to ask questions and share opinions without worrying about drawing too much attention to myself. I guess I'm feeling more social today, I said, which was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. After Aunt Carol and Uncle Bob left, the 5 of us found ourselves back in the living room. But the dynamic had shifted again. The immediate shock of Mr. Harrison's visit had worn off, replaced by a more complex set of emotions that would take much longer to process. I have a confession, Mom said, settling into her favorite chair with a cup of coffee. I called you Aunt Susan while you were all getting dessert ready. The admission hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Aunt Susan was Mom's sister, but more importantly, she was the family's unofficial communication hub. Any information shared with Aunt Susan would be distributed to the entire extended family within 24 hours. Mom, Ryan said, his voice tight with something between panic and resignation. I didn't tell her about the money, Mom said quickly. I just told her that we'd learned some things about Lisa's work situation that we hadn't known before and that we were all very proud of her. What did she say? I asked, though I could probably guess. She said she always knew you had it in you and that she'd never understood why we were so worried about your future. Mom's smile was wry. Apparently, we were the only ones who thought you were struggling. The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. I'd been so focused on managing my immediate family's perceptions that I hadn't considered how my choices might look to more distant relatives who saw me less frequently and with fewer preconceptions. Aunt Susan always liked you, Dad said thoughtfully. She used to say you reminded her of herself at that age. quiet but determined, watching everything, planning ahead. She never said that to me, I replied. She said it to us. Usually, when we were worrying about your career prospects or your social life, she'd tell us to stop fussing, that you knew what you were doing, even if we couldn't see it. I felt an unexpected surge of affection for Aunt Susan, who I'd always considered somewhat distant and intimidating. The idea that she'd been defending my choices during family conversations I'd never heard was both touching and embarrassing. What else did she say? Amanda asked. She asked if this meant you'd finally start dating someone appropriate, Mom said with a slight smile. Apparently, she's been worried that you were limiting your options because you thought you couldn't afford to date men with expensive tastes. The comment made me laugh genuinely and unexpectedly. Aunt Susan, worried about my dating life? She thinks you're too practical for your own good, Mom explained. She's convinced that you've been avoiding relationships because you didn't want to be a financial burden on anyone. It was a theory that was both completely wrong and strangely insightful. I hadn't been avoiding relationships because of money, but I had been avoiding them because I was tired of pretending to be someone I wasn't. Dating while maintaining an elaborate fiction about your financial situation was exhausting and ultimately dishonest. For what it's worth, I said, I haven't been avoiding relationships because of practical concerns. I've been avoiding them because I wasn't ready to let someone see who I really am. And now? Dad asked. Now I guess I'll have to figure that out along with everything else. The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text message. I glanced at the screen and saw a name that made my pulse quicken. James Harrison. Hope your family Easter went well. Mr. H mentioned he stopped by with documents. Call me tomorrow if you need anything clarified. Also, Sarah from the foundation called about the library announcement. They are hoping for a response by Wednesday. I stared at the message, realizing that my carefully compartmentalized life was continuing to merge in ways I hadn't anticipated. James Harrison texting me about family dinner. The foundation wanting to publicize my donation. My two worlds weren't just colliding. They were becoming one world whether I was ready for it or not. Everything okay? Ryan asked, noting my expression. James Harrison texting about the documents his grandfather brought over, I said, and about the library donation. They want to make an announcement. What will you tell them? Mom asked. I'm not sure yet. I need to think about what I'm ready for in terms of public attention. But even as I said it, I knew that the decision had already been made for me in some ways. Mr. Harrison's visit had started a process that couldn't be reversed. My family knew the truth now, which meant that eventually other people would know it, too. The fiction I'd maintained was unraveling, and I could either try to control that process or let it happen organically. Can I ask you something? Ryan said, his voice more tentative than I'd heard it all day. Of course. When you were building all this, when you were making these investments and building relationships with people like James Harrison, were you ever tempted to tell us? Were there moments when you wanted to share it? It was a vulnerable question, asked without defensiveness or resentment. He genuinely wanted to understand my thought process, my emotional experience during those years of secrecy. There were moments, I admitted, especially when you were celebrating your achievements. I sometimes wanted to share mine, too. But then I'd remember how competitive things got between us, how everything became a comparison, and I'd decide to keep quiet. I made it competitive, Ryan said. That was my doing, not yours. We both participated in it. I just chose to compete silently instead of openly. He nodded, absorbing that. I think I understand now why you kept it secret. I don't like it, but I understand it. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. I'm sorry I let you think I was failing when I was actually succeeding. I'm sorry I let you use me as a measuring stick for your own worth. I should have been honest earlier, and I'm sorry I created an environment where honesty felt risky, he replied. I'm sorry I made my own insecurity your problem to manage. The apology felt significant, like the beginning of a different kind of relationship between us. Not the competitive dynamic we'd fallen into as adults, but something more honest and generous. What happens now? Amanda asked, echoing the question that had been hovering over all of our conversations. How do we move forward from here? Carefully, I said honestly, with patience for the fact that it's going to take time to adjust to a new normal. Will you take the board position? Dad asked. Probably. The work interests me and I think I can contribute something valuable. But I'll need to discuss the implications with all of you first. More public visibility means less privacy for the whole family, not just for me. We can handle that, Mom said firmly. We can handle people knowing that our daughter is successful. That's not a burden, Lisa. That's a gift. Her words settled something inside me that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. For years, I'd convinced myself that my success might be a burden for them to carry, that it would change our relationships in ways that weren't necessarily positive. But looking at their faces now, I could see that the burden had been the secrecy, not the success itself. There's something else we need to talk about, I said, knowing that we couldn't avoid this conversation forever. The practical implications of this revelation. I need you all to know that my financial situation doesn't create any obligations for any of you, and it doesn't give me any special authority over family decisions. I'm still just Lisa, your daughter and sister. The money doesn't change that. But it does change some things, Uncle Bob had said earlier, and he was right. Money always changed things, even when people tried to pretend it didn't. Yes, I agreed. It changes some things. It means I can afford to help if someone has a genuine emergency. It means I might be able to contribute to family celebrations in different ways. It means I'll need to be thoughtful about how my choices affect all of you, especially if I take a more public role with the company. And it means, Ryan added quietly, that I need to figure out who I am when I'm not the successful Parker child. You're still successful, I said firmly. You've built a good career. You work hard. You contribute value to your company and your clients. None of that changes because I've been successful, too. But it does change how I think about success, he said. It changes what I think matters and what I think I need to prove. He was right. Of course, the revelation would force all of us to reconsider our definitions of achievement, our understanding of what made a life valuable and meaningful. Those weren't small adjustments. They were fundamental shifts that would take time and conscious effort to navigate. I think, Mom said thoughtfully, that this is going to be good for all of us. Difficult, but good. We've been operating on assumptions for too long. It's time we started dealing with reality. As the afternoon stretched into evening, as we cleaned up the dishes and stored the leftovers and gradually returned the house to its normal post-holiday state, I felt something I hadn't felt in years during family gatherings. I felt seen. Not completely understood, not perfectly accepted, but genuinely seen for who I actually was, rather than who they'd assumed I was. It wasn't the dramatic reconciliation that movies and books promised. There were no tearful declarations of love, no sweeping apologies that erased years of misunderstanding, but there was something more valuable. The beginning of honest relationships based on truth rather than fiction. When I finally left for my apartment that evening, carrying a container of Mom's leftover ham and a slice of Uncle Bob's coconut cake, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of maintaining two separate identities was gone, replaced by the simpler challenge of figuring out how to be fully myself with people who were still learning who that person was. The drive home through familiar riverside streets felt different somehow, like I was seeing the town through new eyes. This was where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to hide parts of myself to keep peace, where I'd built a fortune while pretending to struggle financially. But it was also where I'd learned to analyze and plan, where I'd developed the skills that had made my success possible, where I'd chosen to invest in a library because I remembered what those books had meant to a lonely kid who felt invisible in her own family. Tomorrow, I would call James Harrison and accept the board position. I would call the foundation and agree to the library announcement. I would begin the process of living publicly as the person I'd been privately for years. But tonight, I would sit in my penthouse apartment overlooking the river, eating leftover Easter dinner, and reviewing the contracts that Mr. Harrison had delivered, planning acquisitions and strategic partnerships that would affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in investments. Tonight, for the first time in years, those two versions of myself didn't feel like contradictions. They felt like the same person, finally allowed to exist in the same space. Monday morning arrived with a kind of crisp spring air that made Riverside feel full of possibility. I stood at my office window, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up below me. The familiar routine of morning traffic and bustling pedestrians looked different now that I was no longer hiding who I was. Every person hurrying to work, every business opening its doors, every decision being made in conference rooms across the city felt connected to my story in a way that hadn't existed just days before. My assistant, Maria, knocked on the door, framed and entered with her usual efficiency. She was a sharp woman in her 40s who managed schedules for 3 board members with the kind of precision that made complex logistics look effortless. "Good morning, Lisa. James Harrison called about 20 minutes ago. He wanted to confirm your availability for the emergency board meeting this afternoon. Apparently, there's been a development with the Peterson Industries acquisition." Peterson Industries, the family-owned manufacturing company in Toledo that we'd been courting for 6 months. Their CEO, an old-fashioned businessman named Frank Peterson, had been resistant to selling despite his company's mounting debt and his own approaching retirement. "What kind of development?" I asked, settling behind my desk and opening my laptop. He didn't provide details over the phone, but he sounded pleased, almost excited, which isn't typical for James when it comes to difficult acquisitions. She was right. James Harrison was methodical and cautious, traits that served him well in business, but rarely led to excitement about challenging deals. If he was pleased about Peterson Industries, something significant had changed. "Can you confirm my attendance for the meeting and ask for any background materials they want me to review beforehand?" "Already done. The meeting's at 2:30 in the main conference room. James is having lunch with Mr. Peterson Sr. at noon, so we should have more information by then." After Maria left, I found myself thinking about the timing of this development. Just 2 days after my family had learned about my business success, I was walking into what could be one of the most significant acquisitions in Harrison Industries' recent history. The symmetry felt almost too convenient, like the universe was conspiring to prove that my secret life had been real and substantial. My phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. "Can I take you to lunch today? I have some things I want to discuss." The message surprised me. Since Easter dinner, we'd exchanged a few brief texts, but nothing substantial. I'd assumed he needed more time to process everything before we attempted any real conversation about our relationship moving forward. I texted back, "I'm free until 1:30. Want to meet at Riverside Cafe? Perfect. See you at noon." The cafe was one of those local institutions that had survived downtown revitalization by adapting without losing its character. It served excellent sandwiches and soup to a mix of business professionals and longtime residents, creating the kind of atmosphere where serious conversations could happen without feeling too formal or too casual. Ryan was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table and staring into a cup of coffee like it might contain answers to questions he was still formulating. He looked up as I approached, and I was struck by how different his expression was from the usual confident mask he wore in public. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, standing to give me a brief hug. "I know your schedule is probably more complicated than I realized." I sat down across from him, noting the careful way he was choosing his words. "My schedule is manageable. What's on your mind?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everything. Nothing. I've been doing a lot of thinking since Sunday, and I keep coming back to the same question. How do I fix this?" "Fix what?" "Us. Our relationship. The way I've treated you for years." He leaned forward, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug like it was anchoring him. "I've been going over conversations we've had. Things I've said about your life, your choices, your future, and I'm horrified, Lisa. I'm genuinely horrified by how cruel I've been." "Ryan, no, let me finish. I need to say this." He took a deep breath. "I called Ginny yesterday and told her about what happened at Easter dinner. Not the money stuff, just that I'd learned some things about my sister that made me realize I'd been a terrible brother. And you know what she said?" I waited, sensing that this was important for him to share. She said she wasn't surprised. She said she'd been wondering for months why I always talked about you like you were some kind of cautionary tale, when you seemed like one of the most together people she'd ever met. He shook his head. "My own girlfriend could see what I couldn't." She could see that you were successful and confident and happy while I was busy convincing myself that you were struggling so I could feel better about my own insecurities. The admission was raw and honest in a way that Ryan rarely allowed himself to be. I could see how much the revelation was costing him, not just in terms of wounded pride, but in forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own character. What did Jenny say when you told her the whole story? That she wanted to meet you properly. That she'd always felt like I was keeping her at arm's length from my family. And now she understands why. I was too ashamed of how I treated you to let her get close enough to see it clearly. Our server appeared to take our orders, giving us both a moment to regroup. When she left, Ryan continued with a conversation that was clearly weighing heavily on him. I've been thinking about why I did it, why I needed to believe you were failing in order to feel good about my own success. And I think it goes back to when we were kids. How so? You were always smarter than me, always more focused, more disciplined, more naturally good at things that mattered. In school, you got better grades without seeming to try as hard. You understood math concepts that I had to struggle with. You read books that I couldn't get through. I never thought about our childhood dynamic in those terms, but I could see how Ryan might have experienced it that way. Academic achievement had come more easily to me, though I'd always assumed that was simply a matter of different strengths rather than a reflection of overall intelligence. When we got older and I found sales, I finally had something I was good at, something that got me praise and recognition and financial rewards. For the first time, I felt like I was winning at something that mattered to adults. You were good at sales because you're naturally good with people, I said. That's a genuine skill, Ryan. It's not something I could do well. Maybe not, but when you didn't immediately follow the same path I did, when you took a quieter approach to your career, I convinced myself it was because you couldn't compete. I told myself you were playing it safe because you weren't brave enough or ambitious enough to take real risks. He paused as our sandwiches arrived, but neither of us touched our food immediately. The truth is, I was terrified that you were going to surpass me again, that you were going to find some quiet, brilliant way to be more successful than I was, and I'd go back to being the Parker child who wasn't quite as smart, wasn't quite as capable. So, I kept putting you down, kept reinforcing the narrative that you were the one who hadn't lived up to your potential. But I did surpass you, I said gently, by every external measure of success that you value. I've been more financially successful than you for years, and the world didn't end. I know that now. But knowing it intellectually and accepting it emotionally are different things. He finally took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. I called my therapist this morning. The statement surprised me. I hadn't known Ryan was in therapy, though I suppose there were many things about his life that I didn't know. I've been seeing Dr. Martinez for about 6 months. Jenny suggested it when I was going through a rough patch at work last fall. She said I seemed angry all the time and that I was taking it out on people who didn't deserve it. Is it helping? More than I expected, especially now. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my need to compete with you wasn't really about you at all. It was about my own fear of not being enough, not mattering, not having value beyond my achievements. He looked directly at me for the first time since we'd started talking about difficult topics. I want to be a better brother to you, Lisa. I want to have a relationship that isn't built on competition or comparison or me needing to feel superior, but I don't know how to do that yet. You start by having conversations like this one, I suggested. You start by being honest about your feelings instead of expressing them through criticism or condescension. You start by asking questions about my life because you're genuinely interested, not because you're looking for ammunition. Can you be patient with me while I figure that out? Can you give me a chance to prove that I can change? The vulnerability in his question was so genuine that I felt something shift in my chest. A loosening of defensive walls I'd built over years of protecting myself from his judgment. Of course, I can. But Ryan, I need you to understand something. I don't need you to change in order to be okay. I've built a good life, a life I'm proud of, regardless of our family dynamics. I'm not waiting for your approval or your acceptance to feel good about my choices. I know. That's what makes this even more important. You don't need anything from me, which means that anything I offer has to be genuine. It has to come from a place of actually caring about you as a person, not from obligation or guilt. We ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing the weight of the conversation. I found myself studying Ryan's face, looking for signs of the brother I'd grown up with before competition and insecurity had complicated our relationship. He was still there, I realized, the boy who taught me to ride a bike and defended me from neighborhood bullies and shared late-night conversations about our dreams for the future. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. "Always. When you were building your investment portfolio, when you were learning about business and finance, did you ever think about asking me for advice? I mean, I know I was insufferable about my own success, but I do have experience with client relationships and business development." It was a fair question and one that deserved an honest answer. I thought about it sometimes, especially in the early days when I was trying to understand market psychology and client behavior, but I was afraid that asking for your help would give you ammunition to use against me later if things didn't work out. That's fair and probably accurate given how I was behaving. But also, I continued, I needed to prove to myself that I could do it independently. I needed to know that my success was truly mine, not borrowed or dependent on connections through family. "Do you think you would have been as successful if you'd had more support from us? If we'd been encouraging instead of dismissive?" I considered the question seriously. I honestly don't know. The independence forced me to be more thorough in my research, more careful in my decision-making. It made me develop confidence in my own judgment that I might not have cultivated if I'd had a safety net of family advice and support. So, in a weird way, our dismissal of your potential actually helped you succeed. Maybe, or maybe I would have been successful either way, just along a different path. I smiled. I'll never know for sure, and I'm okay with that uncertainty. My phone buzzed with a reminder about the board meeting. 1:15. I needed to head back to the office soon to review materials and prepare for what could be a significant discussion about Peterson Industries. "I have to get back to work," I said, reaching for my wallet. "Let me get lunch," Ryan said quickly. "It's the least I can do." "Thank you." As we stood to leave, Ryan hesitated. "Can I ask what you're heading back to? What does your afternoon look like?" For a moment, I almost deflected with a vague answer about meetings and paperwork. The old habit of protecting my professional life from family scrutiny was still strong. But then I remembered that the secrecy was over now, that I'd committed to being honest about who I was and what I did. Board meeting at 2:30. We're discussing the potential acquisition of a manufacturing company in Toledo. It's been a complicated negotiation, but something changed over the weekend that has James Harrison optimistic. "James Harrison," he repeated slowly. "That's the grandson of the man who came to Easter dinner." "Yes, he's the CEO of Harrison Industries, and has become a good friend over the years we've worked together." Ryan nodded slowly. "What's your role in the acquisition discussions?" "I'm responsible for evaluating the financial structure and the potential integration challenges. Manufacturing companies have different risk profiles than the tech and service businesses we usually acquire. So, my background with small business operations is relevant to the due diligence process." I could see him processing this information, trying to reconcile the sister he thought he knew with the woman who evaluated multimillion-dollar acquisitions for a major corporation. That sounds like a lot of responsibility. It is, but it's also the kind of challenge I've been preparing for, whether I realized it or not, for years. We walked out of the cafe together, and Ryan paused on the sidewalk. "Lisa, can I say something without it sounding patronizing or strange?" "You can try. I'm proud of you, not just for the money or the business success, but for the person you've become. You're confident without being arrogant, successful without being flashy, powerful without being intimidating. I hope I can learn to be more like that." The compliment caught me off guard with its sincerity. "Thank you. That means more than you probably know. And I hope," he continued, "that someday you'll trust me enough to share more of your professional life with me. Not because I want to take credit for your success, but because I want to understand what you're passionate about, what challenges you, what excites you about your work." "I'd like that, too," I said, meaning it. Back at my office, I immersed myself in preparation for the board meeting. The Peterson Industries file was thick with financial statements, market analyses, and correspondence dating back 6 months. Frank Peterson had built his company from a small machine shop into a regional manufacturing power, but changing markets and increased competition had put strain on operations that his traditional management style couldn't address. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was preparing to discuss the future of a family business on the same day that I'd had my most honest conversation with Ryan in years. Family businesses faced unique challenges when it came to succession planning, professional management, and the balance between emotional attachments and financial realities. At 2:20, I gathered my materials and headed to the main conference room. James Harrison was already there, along with the other board members and several senior executives. The energy in the room was different from our usual meetings, more focused and anticipatory. "Lisa, glad you could make it," James said, standing to shake my hand. "I think you're going to find this development interesting." He gestured for everyone to take their seats around the polished conference table. The room's floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of downtown Riverside that reminded me how much the city had changed since my childhood. How much growth and development had occurred while I was quietly building my own success. As you all know, we've been pursuing Peterson Industries for months without making significant progress. Frank Peterson has been resistant to discussions about acquisition or partnership despite his company's obvious need for capital infusion and strategic guidance. James opened a folder and distributed copies of what appeared to be a letter. "This morning, I received this communication from Peterson's legal counsel. He's requesting a formal meeting to discuss terms for a potential sale." I scanned the letter quickly, noting the professional but urgent tone. Something had shifted dramatically in Peterson's position, and the timing suggested external pressure rather than a gradual change of heart. "What changed?" asked Margaret Wells, our longest-serving board member and former CFO of a Fortune 500 company. "Two things," James replied. "First, Peterson's largest client, Automotive Solutions International, announced last week that they are moving their manufacturing contracts to overseas suppliers. That represents about 30% of Peterson's revenue." The room was quiet as we all absorbed the implications. Losing a client of that magnitude would create immediate cash flow problems and force difficult decisions about workforce and facility management. Second, and more importantly for our purposes, Frank Peterson received a competing acquisition offer from Meridian Capital Group. They are offering significantly below market value and planning to strip the company for parts, selling off the valuable assets and closing the manufacturing facilities. I knew Meridian's reputation. They specialized in distressed acquisitions, buying struggling companies cheaply and extracting maximum value with little regard for employees or community impact. For a man like Frank Peterson, who'd built his company as a cornerstone of Toledo's manufacturing economy, the prospect of selling to Meridian would be devastating. So, he's coming to us because we represent a better alternative. I asked. "Exactly. We've consistently presented ourselves as interested in preserving and growing the business rather than dismantling it. For Peterson, we're not just a buyer. We're a lifeline that allows his company to survive intact." Margaret leaned forward. "What are his terms?" "That's what we need to discuss. He's asking for a purchase price that's higher than Meridian's offer, but still below our original valuation. More importantly, he wants guarantees about workforce retention and facility preservation. He wants to know that selling to us won't result in mass layoffs or plant closures." The conversation that followed was exactly the kind of strategic discussion that had drawn me to board service in the first place. We weren't just talking about financial returns or market positioning. We were talking about the responsibility that came with acquiring a company that employed hundreds of people and anchored an entire community's economic stability. "What's our integration timeline?" asked David Chen, our newest board member and an expert in manufacturing logistics. "That depends partly on Lisa's assessment," James said, turning to me. "You've been leading our analysis of operational compatibility and cultural fit. What's your recommendation?" I felt the familiar rush of being asked for my professional opinion on a decision that would affect thousands of lives and millions of dollars. This was why I'd accepted board membership, why I'd been willing to step into a more public role with the company. These were the kinds of decisions that mattered beyond quarterly profit reports. Peterson's company culture is built around craftsmanship and community connection, I began, referring to my notes from site visits and employee interviews. Their workforce is experienced and loyal, but they've been operating with outdated technology and limited capital for equipment upgrades. The acquisition opportunity isn't just about buying their client base or their facilities. It's about investing in human capital that could drive innovation if given proper resources. I paused, looking around the table at faces that I'd learned to read over months of working together. These were people who valued thoughtful analysis and long-term thinking, who understood that sustainable business success required more than aggressive cost-cutting. My recommendation is that we proceed with the acquisition, but with a 3-year integration plan that prioritizes technology upgrades and workforce development before we attempt any operational consolidation. Peterson's employees have institutional knowledge about manufacturing processes that we can't replace easily. If we invest in training and modernization, we can probably increase productivity by 20 to 30% within 2 years. What about the financial risk? Margaret asked. If the automotive industry continues shifting toward overseas manufacturing, are we buying into a declining market? That's the right question, but I think we're looking at market transformation rather than market decline. The companies that will succeed in the new environment are those that can offer specialized manufacturing, rapid prototyping, and customized solutions that overseas suppliers can't match. Peterson's workforce has the skills to adapt to that model if we give them the tools and training. James was nodding as I spoke, and I could see approval on the faces of other board members. This was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that Harrison Industries had built its reputation on. We didn't just acquire companies. We partnered with them to create sustainable growth. Are you comfortable taking the lead on due diligence and integration planning? James asked. Absolutely, but I'd want to spend significant time on-site in Toledo working with Peterson's management team and key employees. Successful integration requires understanding the company culture from the inside, not just analyzing it from financial reports. How much time are we talking about? Probably 2 days a week for the first 3 months, then 1 day a week for the following 6 months. It's a significant commitment, but it's necessary if we want to preserve what makes Peterson valuable while helping them adapt to changing market conditions. The meeting continued for another hour as we discussed financing structures, regulatory approvals, and timeline considerations. By the time we adjourned, I had been appointed lead coordinator for the Peterson acquisition, with responsibility for overseeing due diligence, integration planning, and ongoing operational oversight. Walking back to my office afterward, I felt the same sense of professional satisfaction that had drawn me to business in the first place. This wasn't just about making money, though the acquisition would certainly be profitable if executed properly. It was about using financial resources and business expertise to solve real problems, to preserve jobs, to help a community maintain economic stability during a period of industrial transition. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. How was your day, sweetheart? Ryan said you two had a good lunch conversation. I smiled at the message, recognizing the careful way she was asking about both my work and my relationship with Ryan. The revelation about my financial success had created new possibilities for family connection, but it had also created new anxieties about how to navigate relationships that had been redefined almost overnight. They went well. Took on a new project that will keep me busy for the next few months. And yes, lunch with Ryan was good. We're figuring things out. I'm glad to hear that. Your father and I have been talking about everything, and we want you to know how proud we are of who you've become. Thank you. That means everything to me. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave the office, I realized that today had marked another milestone in the process of integrating my two lives. I'd shared details about my work with Ryan in a way that felt natural rather than defensive. I'd taken on professional responsibilities that would make my success more visible to the business community, and probably to my family as well. I'd made decisions that would affect the lives of hundreds of people I'd never met in a town I'd visited only a few times. The woman who drove home to her penthouse apartment that evening was the same woman who'd sat through countless family dinners, listening to Ryan's business stories while keeping her own achievement secret. But she was also different, more complete, more willing to be seen and known for who she actually was rather than who others assumed her to be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the Peterson acquisition moved forward, as my family continued to adjust to the truth about my life, as I navigated the complex process of living openly as someone who had significant financial resources and professional influence. But tonight, I would review acquisition documents while eating leftover Easter ham, planning strategies for preserving jobs in Toledo while sitting in an apartment that overlooked the river where I'd learned to fish with my father 20 years ago. Tonight, for the first time in years, those two versions of myself didn't feel like contradictions. They felt like the same person, finally allowed to exist in the same space. 3 months later, I stood in the main assembly hall of Peterson Industries, watching Frank Peterson address his workforce for what would be the last time as their independent owner. The acquisition had been finalized the week before, but today marked the symbolic transition as Harrison Industries officially took operational control of the Toledo facility. The transformation had been remarkable to witness from the inside. What had started as a desperate attempt to avoid a corporate dismantling had evolved into something more profound, a genuine partnership between two companies with complementary strengths and shared values. Frank Peterson had approached the integration process with the same methodical care he'd applied to building his business over 3 decades, while our team had brought capital resources and market expertise that opened new possibilities for growth. 32 years ago, I started this company with 12 employees and a dream of building something that would last, Frank said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall where nearly 400 workers had gathered. Today, I'm proud to say the dream is continuing, just in a different form than I originally imagined. I watched the faces in the crowd, recognizing many of them from the weeks I'd spent on site during the integration planning process. Maria Santos, the quality control supervisor who'd been with the company for 15 years and whose insights about production efficiency had influenced our entire modernization strategy. David Kumar, the young engineer whose ideas about automated inventory management had impressed our technology team enough to fast-track implementation. Janet Williams, the floor supervisor whose leadership during the transition had been essential to maintaining morale during a period of uncertainty. These weren't just employees being transferred from one owner to another. They were skilled professionals whose expertise and institutional knowledge had been the foundation of Peterson's success and would be essential to Harrison Industries' expansion into manufacturing markets. I want to introduce you to Lisa Parker, whom many of you have met over the past few months, Frank continued, gesturing toward where I stood near the front of the assembly. Lisa will be serving as our integration coordinator, working to ensure that the transition preserves what makes this company special while positioning us for future growth. The polite applause that followed felt different from the reception I'd received during my first visits to the plant. Initially, there had been skepticism about the young woman in business attire, who claimed to understand manufacturing operations despite her obvious inexperience with factory floors and production schedules. But over time, as workers saw that I was genuinely interested in their perspectives and committed to preserving their jobs, the wariness had given way to cautious cooperation and eventually to something approaching respect. After Frank's speech, I found myself surrounded by small groups of employees asking questions about everything from healthcare benefits to equipment upgrade timelines. These conversations had become routine over the past month, but they still felt significant to me. Each question represented someone's livelihood, someone's family's financial security, someone's professional future. Miss Parker called out Tom Rodriguez, a machinist who'd become an unofficial spokesperson for the production floor workers. Can you give us an update on the new CNC equipment installation? The first 2 units arrived yesterday and will be operational by next Friday, I replied. We'll be starting with a training program for the senior machinists, then expanding to the full production team over the following month. The goal is to have everyone comfortable with the new systems before we begin taking on the automotive contracts that require the additional precision capabilities. And the overtime situation during the training period, asked Janet Williams. Anyone participating in the training program will receive their regular hourly rate for training time, plus overtime rates for any production work that extends beyond normal hours during the transition. We understand that learning new systems while maintaining current output levels is challenging, and we want to compensate people fairly for that extra effort. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, covering topics that ranged from technical specifications to policy details. I'd learned that transparency about operational changes was essential to maintaining the trust we'd built during the acquisition process. These workers had seen other companies acquired and stripped for parts. They needed concrete evidence that Harrison Industries was committed to investment rather than extraction. After the formal meeting ended, I walked through the production areas with Frank, conducting the kind of operational review that had become second nature over the past months. The facility was impressive in its organization and efficiency, but I could also see the areas where capital investment would yield immediate improvements in productivity and worker safety. The environmental control system in buildings needs upgrading before winter, Frank noted as we passed through the main fabrication area. It's been adequate for current operations, but the new equipment will generate more heat and worker comfort is going to become an issue. I made a note on my tablet. I'll get estimates from 3 contractors this week. What's the timeline for installation without disrupting production schedules? If we start by mid-August, we can complete the work during the annual maintenance shutdown in September. That gives us 6 weeks to coordinate with the CNC installation and the new inventory management system rollout. The level of detail required for successful integration was staggering, but it was also exactly the kind of systematic problem-solving that had drawn me to business analysis in the first place. Every decision affected multiple other decisions, creating cascading consequences that required careful planning and constant adjustment. My phone buzzed with a call from James Harrison. "Excuse me, Frank. I need to take this." "Lisa, hope the transition event went well this morning," James said when I answered. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something that's developing on the Peterson front." "What kind of development?" "Good news, actually. The automotive contracts we've been pursuing with Peterson's enhanced capabilities are starting to materialize faster than we anticipated. General Dynamics called this morning about a specialized component manufacturing project that could represent about $15 million in annual revenue." I felt a familiar surge of excitement mixed with the weight of responsibility. $15 million in new revenue would justify the entire Peterson acquisition within 2 years. But it would also require operational expansions that needed to be managed carefully to avoid disrupting the integration process we'd worked so hard to execute smoothly. "What's the timeline?" I asked. "They want to start with a pilot program in October with full production beginning in January. The question is whether Peterson's facility can handle the capacity requirements without major capital investments beyond what we've already planned. I'll need to review the specifications and talk to our production managers, but my initial sense is that we can accommodate the pilot program with current equipment and staff. Full production might require adding a second shift and some additional machinery. Can you put together a preliminary assessment by Friday? The board wants to discuss the opportunity at next week's meeting." After hanging up, I found Frank and shared the news about the potential contract. His reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. Excitement about the growth opportunity tempered by realistic concerns about execution challenges. $15 million is significant, he said, but it's also the kind of rapid expansion that can strain operations if we're not careful. The good news is that our workforce has experience with automotive precision requirements. The challenging part will be scaling up without compromising quality standards. What would you need in terms of additional staff and equipment for the pilot program? Probably nothing beyond what we're already planning. For full production, we'd need to hire about 30 additional workers and invest in specialized testing equipment. The bigger question is whether we can find qualified machinists in the local labor market. It was a valid concern. Toledo's manufacturing workforce was experienced and skilled, but unemployment was low and competition for talented workers was intense. Any significant hiring initiative would require competitive compensation packages and possibly training programs for workers with adjacent skills. Let's start by assessing our current capacity and identifying the specific skill sets we'd need for expansion, I suggested. Then we can develop a recruitment strategy that builds on the reputation Peterson has in the local manufacturing community. The conversation was interrupted by Maria Santos, who approached with the kind of urgent expression that typically indicated a production issue requiring immediate attention. "Frank, Lisa, sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation with the 5 Johnson order. The client is requesting a specification change that would require retooling 3 of our main production lines." What kind of specification change? Frank asked. They want to modify the tolerance requirements for the bearing assemblies. The new specs are tighter than what we originally quoted, which means we'd need to recalibrate all the precision equipment and probably add an additional quality control step. I exchanged glances with Frank, recognizing the kind of mid-project change request that could either be an opportunity to demonstrate flexibility and capability, or a costly disruption that damaged profitability and client relationships. What's the timeline for implementation? I asked. They want the first modified units delivered in 6 weeks. That gives us about 10 days to complete the retooling and validate the new processes before we need to begin production. And the cost implications. Roughly $30,000 in retooling costs plus about 15% more production time per unit. If we can negotiate a price adjustment with Johnson, it's manageable. If not, the project becomes marginally profitable. This was exactly the kind of operational decision that illustrated why the Peterson acquisition had been more complex than a simple financial transaction. We weren't just buying machinery and facilities. We were inheriting relationships with clients who had existing expectations and contractual obligations that needed to be honored while positioning the company for future growth. Set up a call with Johnson's project manager for tomorrow morning, I said. We'll present them with options for implementing the specification change along with the associated cost adjustments. Frank, can you have your production team prepare detailed estimates for the retooling requirements? Absolutely. Maria, let's schedule a planning session with the floor supervisors for later this afternoon. As Maria headed back to coordinate with the production team, I realized that this kind of real-time problem solving had become the most satisfying aspect of my work with Harrison Industries. The board meetings and strategic planning sessions were important, but there was something particularly rewarding about working through operational challenges that had immediate impact on workers' daily lives and the company's ability to serve its clients effectively. My phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. How's Toledo? Mom mentioned you're spending a lot of time there these days. The message made me smile. Over the past months, Ryan had been making genuine efforts to engage with my professional life in ways that felt supportive rather than competitive. He asked thoughtful questions about the challenges of business integration, offered insights from his own experience with client relationship management, and seemed genuinely interested in understanding the work that had become central to my identity. I texted back, wrapping up the ownership transition today. It's been a good process overall. How are things with the Henderson account? Henderson Industries was Ryan's largest client, a logistics company that had been considering expanding their operations into the Southeast. Ryan had been working on the proposal for months, and I knew that landing the contract would represent a significant achievement for his career. Presentation is scheduled for next Friday. Jenny helped me refine the proposal, and I think we have a strong case. Thanks for asking. The text exchange was brief, but it represented the kind of normal sibling communication that had been absent from our relationship for years. We were learning to share professional updates without turning them into competitions, to celebrate each other's successes without feeling diminished by them, to offer support without needing to demonstrate superiority. Later that afternoon, I drove back to Riverside, taking the scenic route that passed through small towns that had been shaped by the same economic forces affecting Peterson Industries. Manufacturing communities throughout Ohio had struggled with plant closures and job losses as companies moved operations overseas or adopted automation technologies that reduced workforce requirements. The Peterson acquisition represented a different approach to these challenges, one that recognized the value of experienced workers and established community relationships while investing in technology and market development that could sustain employment over the long term. It wasn't a solution that would work for every situation, but it demonstrated that strategic business thinking could align with social responsibility in ways that benefited all stakeholders. Arriving back in Riverside, I stopped by my parents' house for dinner, a weekly tradition that had developed organically over the past months. The Sunday evening meals had become opportunities for genuinely connecting with family members who were still adjusting to the reality of who I actually was, but who were making conscious efforts to build relationships based on truth rather than assumptions. How did the transition ceremony go? Mom asked as she set plates around the kitchen table. Frank Peterson must be feeling emotional about officially handing over the company. He handled it with a lot of grace, I replied, helping to carry dishes from the kitchen. But I think he's also relieved to know that the business will continue operating as a manufacturing facility rather than being sold off for parts. That's what matters most to people like Frank, Dad said, settling into his usual chair. Building something that lasts, creating jobs that support families, contributing to the community. Money is important, but it's not the only measure of success. The comment was typical of the evolution in Dad's perspective over the past months. The revelation about my financial success had prompted him to reconsider his own definitions of achievement and to recognize that there were multiple valid paths to building a meaningful career. Any word on the potential automotive contract James mentioned? Ryan asked. I was still adjusting to having family members who knew enough about my work to ask informed questions about ongoing projects. Preliminary discussions are positive, but we need to complete a capacity analysis before committing to anything. It would represent significant growth for the Toledo facility, but only if we can execute it without compromising quality or worker safety. Sounds like the kind of challenge you're good at solving, he said, and I could hear genuine confidence in his assessment rather than the competitive edge that had characterized his comments about my work in the past. The conversation continued through dinner, ranging across topics that included Amanda's new job at a marketing firm, Dad's plans for retirement, and Mom's involvement with a library foundation that would soon be announcing my donation for the children's wing. The ease of these discussions still surprised me sometimes. The way that honesty about one aspect of my life had opened up possibilities for connection across all aspects of our family relationships. After dinner, Ryan and I found ourselves alone on the back porch while Mom and Dad cleaned up inside. The early evening air was warm and still, carrying the scent of Mom's rose garden and the distant sound of children playing in neighboring yards. "Can I tell you something?" Ryan said, settling into the wicker chair that had been his favorite spot for serious conversation since we were teenagers. "Of course. I've been thinking a lot about success lately, about what it means, what it's worth, why it matters." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Before Easter, I thought success was about being better than other people, about proving that you were smarter or harder working or more deserving than everyone else. And now I think it's about becoming who you're supposed to be, about using your skills and opportunities to contribute something valuable to the world. Your work with Peterson Industries isn't just about making money for Harrison Industries. It's about preserving jobs and helping a community maintain economic stability." I nodded, recognizing the shift in perspective that had been evident in our conversations over the past months. "My work with Henderson Industries isn't going to change the world," he continued, "but it might help them expand their operations in ways that create jobs and improve supply chain efficiency for their clients. That feels more meaningful than just trying to outsell my colleagues." "Success doesn't have to be world-changing to be meaningful," I said. "It just has to be authentic to who you are and aligned with values that matter to you." That's what I'm learning. And I'm also learning that my success doesn't depend on your failure, and your success doesn't diminish my achievements. We can both be successful in our own ways without it being a competition. As the sun set behind the trees in Mom's backyard, casting long shadows across the lawn where we'd played as children, I felt a deep sense of completion about the journey that had begun with Mr. Harrison's unexpected visit 3 months earlier. The revelation about my financial success had been dramatic and disruptive, but it had also created opportunities for honesty and connection that wouldn't have been possible while I was maintaining the fiction of my struggling circumstances. The woman who sat on that porch was the same person who had spent years quietly building a fortune while letting her family believe she was barely getting by. But she was also different, more complete, more willing to be known and seen and valued for who she actually was rather than who others assumed her to be. My phone buzzed with an email from the Riverside Community Foundation. The subject line read, "Library Groundbreaking Announcement." And I knew that tomorrow would bring another milestone in the process of living openly as someone with significant resources and influence. The anonymous donation phase of my philanthropy was ending, replaced by the more complex challenge of using wealth and position responsibly while maintaining the privacy and authenticity that had always been important to me. But I was ready for that challenge, supported by family relationships that had been rebuilt on foundations of truth rather than assumption. as Ryan and I eventually headed inside to rejoin our parents for coffee. In the kind of comfortable conversation that had become routine rather than strained, I realized that the most valuable transformation over the past months hadn't been professional or financial. It had been personal, the discovery that I could be fully myself with the people who mattered most, and that being known was better than being misunderstood, even when misunderstanding felt safer. The next morning, I would return to Toledo to begin implementation of the automotive contract proposal. I would spend the following weeks balancing strategic planning with operational details, working to ensure that Peterson Industries' expansion served all stakeholders rather than just shareholders. I would continue building a career that aligned financial success with social responsibility, that used business expertise to solve real problems for real people. But first, I would spend another hour on the porch with my family, talking about everything and nothing, being Lisa Parker, the sister and daughter, rather than Lisa Parker, the board member and major shareholder, being both finally without contradiction or apology. The woman who drove home to her penthouse apartment that night was wealthy and successful and influential in ways that few people achieved. She was also content, connected, and known by the people who loved her. For the first time in years, those identities felt like they belonged to the same person, living the same integrated life. This whole journey has made me reflect so much on how we define success and how much we let others' perceptions shape our own sense of worth. What about you? Have you ever felt the pressure to hide parts of yourself from the people closest to you, or had to redefine what success truly means to you? Let me know in the comments below. I'd really love to hear your stories.